The first contraction hit Vanessa Martinez like a lightning bolt as she was mucking out the horse stalls at the Copper Ridge Ranch. She gripped the wooden rail, her knuckles white, as a wave of pain rolled through her swollen belly. 8 months. She wasn't supposed to be due for another month, but babies don't follow schedules, especially when you're broke, alone, and sleeping in a barn loft because you have nowhere else to go. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months earlier, Vanessa had arrived at Copper Ridge Ranch with nothing but a duffel bag, $47, and a secret she couldn't share with anyone. The classified ad in the local paper had been simple: ranch hand needed, hard work, basic pay, room provided. She'd driven her dying Honda Civic down the dusty gravel road, past fields of grazing cattle and endless Montana sky, praying this would be the fresh start she desperately needed. Jake Sullivan had been standing on the porch of the main house when she pulled up, his weathered cowboy hat casting shadows over sharp blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. At 32, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd built everything he owned from scratch. The ranch had been in financial trouble when he'd bought it 5 years ago, but through sheer determination and 18-hour days, he'd turned it into one of the most successful operations in 3 counties. "You, Vanessa?" he'd asked, his voice carrying that slow Montana drawl that made her stomach flutter in ways she couldn't afford. "Yes, sir. I'm here about the job." His eyes had traveled over her slight frame with obvious skepticism. At 24, Vanessa looked even younger, with long, dark hair she kept pulled back and clothes that hung loose on her small frame. Partly from being too big, partly to hide what she needed to hide. "Ever worked cattle before?" "No, sir, but I'm a quick learner. I grew up on a farm in Nebraska before." She'd caught herself before saying too much, before everything fell apart, before Marcus. Before she'd had to run, Jake had studied her for a long moment, something in her desperate expression making him nod slowly. "Pays not much. $300 a week plus room and board. You'll bunk in the loft above the main barn. Work starts at sunrise, ends when the work's done. No drinking, no drugs, no visitors without permission. You break anything expensive, it comes out of your pay. Are we clear?" Crystal clear. That first month had been the hardest physical work of Vanessa's life. Her hands, soft from her previous job as a grocery store clerk, became calloused and cracked. Her back ached constantly from hauling feed bags and cleaning stalls. But there was something healing about the rhythm of ranch life, the honesty of the work, the way the animals didn't judge her or ask questions about her past. Jake proved to be a fair but demanding boss. He worked alongside his crew, 3 other ranch hands named Tommy, Carlos, and Old Pete, never asking them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. He was quiet, observing more than talking, but Vanessa caught him watching her sometimes with an expression she couldn't quite read. The other hands had accepted her quickly enough. Tommy, barely 19 and fresh out of high school, treated her like a kid sister. Carlos, in his 40s with a family in town, was protective and kind. Old Pete, who'd been working ranches since before Vanessa was born, became her unofficial mentor, teaching her the subtle art of reading cattle behavior and weather patterns. But it was Jake who occupied her thoughts during the long, exhausting days. She found herself looking forward to the brief moments when he'd stop by whatever section she was working, offering quiet corrections or rare words of approval. There was something about his calm presence that made her feel safe for the first time in months. The attraction was dangerous, and Vanessa knew it. She was hiding too much. Her real last name, her reason for leaving Nebraska, and most importantly, the growing curve of her belly that she disguised with oversized shirts and careful positioning. She'd calculated that she could probably hide the pregnancy until she was 7 or 8 months along, maybe longer if she was careful, By then, she'd have saved enough money to disappear again, find somewhere else to have the baby and figure out what came next. But plans have a way of crumbling, especially when you're living a lie. It started with small things. Jake brought her an extra sandwich at lunch when he noticed she wasn't eating much, him reassigning her from the heavier lifting tasks to fence repair and equipment maintenance. The way his hand would linger on her shoulder when he was explaining something, or how his voice would soften when he spoke to her. The night everything changed started like any other. Vanessa was in the barn doing a final check on the horses before heading up to her loft when Jake appeared in the doorway. He'd been working on the books in his office, she knew, wrestling with the endless paperwork that came with running an operation this size. "Vanessa?" His voice was different somehow, rougher. She'd turned from Thunder's stall, her heart immediately picking up pace. In the dim light of the barn, with hay dust dancing in the air and the familiar smell of leather and horses surrounding them, Jake looked like something out of a dream, or maybe a romance novel she'd read once upon a time when she'd believed in happy endings. "Something wrong with the horses?" she'd asked, though she knew that wasn't why he was there. He'd stepped closer, close enough that she could see the day's stubble on his jaw, smell the faint scent of his cologne mixed with honest sweat. "No, horses are fine." The silence stretched between them, loaded with everything they weren't saying. Vanessa knew she should step back, make an excuse, escape to her loft before she did something stupid. But when Jake reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin, all her good intentions evaporated. "You're not like the others," he'd murmured, his thumb tracing along her cheekbone. "There's something about you I can't figure out." If only he knew, she'd thought, but instead of confessing, instead of being smart, she'd leaned into his touch like a flower turning toward the sun. What happened next was inevitable, had been building. For weeks, in stolen glances and accidental touches, Jake's lips were warm and sure against hers, his hands gentle but insistent as they pulled her closer. For the first time in months, Vanessa felt truly alive, truly wanted. They'd made love in the hayloft that night, and 3 more times over the following weeks. Jake was tender and passionate, treating her like she was made of something precious. He never pushed for information about her past, seemed content to live in the present moment of what they were building together. But secrets have a weight to them, and Vanessa's were growing heavier by the day, literally. By her 6th month, even the loosest clothes couldn't completely hide her condition, especially from someone who spent as much time looking at her as Jake did. She'd planned to tell him, had rehearsed the conversation 100 times in her head while she worked, but every time she opened her mouth to speak, the words died in her throat. How do you tell the man you're falling in love with that you're carrying another man's children? How do you explain that you're not just pregnant, but pregnant with twins from a relationship that had nearly destroyed you? The decision was taken, out of her hands on a Tuesday morning in November, when Jake walked into the barn and found her doubled over next to Thunder's stall, one hand pressed to her back, the other cradling her unmistakably rounded belly. The silence that followed Jake's discovery felt like eternity. Vanessa straightened slowly, her hand still instinctively protective over her belly, watching as a dozen emotions flickered across his face: shock, confusion, hurt, and something that might have been betrayal. "How long?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through her like a blade. 6 months. The words came out cracked and small. Jake's jaw worked silently as he processed this information. His eyes moved from her face to her belly and back again, calculating. "The whole time you've been here, it wasn't a question, but Vanessa nodded anyway. I was going to tell you." "When?" The word exploded from him with such force that Thunder snorted and shifted nervously in his stall. "When exactly were you planning to mention that you're carrying someone else's baby? After you disappeared in the middle of the night? After I found you giving birth in my barn?" Vanessa flinched, as if he'd struck her. The cruel accuracy of his second guess hit too close to home. "It's not that simple." "Then explain it to me." Jake's voice had gone dangerously quiet, the kind of calm that preceded a storm. "Explain how sleeping with me while you're pregnant with another man's child is complicated." The shame burned through her chest like acid. She'd known this moment would come eventually, but she'd foolishly hoped it would be on her terms, when she was ready, when she'd found the right words. Instead, she stood there speechless, while the man she'd grown to love looked at her like she was a stranger. His name was Marcus Reed. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "We were together for 2 years. I thought we were going to get married." Jake's expression didn't soften. If anything, his face grew harder. "And?" "He changed when I told him about the pregnancy. I said I was trying to trap him, that he wasn't ready to be tied down. When I told him it was twins." Vanessa's voice broke slightly. "He said I'd done it on purpose, got violent. I had to leave. So you came here, to my ranch, and decided to what? Seduce me into playing daddy to his kids?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The accusation hit her like a physical blow. "No, it wasn't like that. I never meant for anything to happen between us. I was trying to save money so I could leave, start over somewhere else. I never expected to fall into my bed." Heat flamed across her cheeks. "I never expected to feel anything for anyone again. What happened between us? It wasn't part of some plan. It was real." Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Real, right. Was any of it real, Vanessa? Your name? Your story about Nebraska? Or is that all made up too?" She opened her mouth to answer, then closed it. Because he was right. Almost everything she'd told him had been a lie or a half-truth. Even her name, which was real, felt false. "In her mouth now. I see." Jake turned away from her, running a hand through his dark hair. "Jesus Christ, Vanessa, do you have any idea what you've done? I know I should have told you. You should have told me before you let me touch you." He spun back around, his blue eyes blazing. "You should have told me before I started falling for you, before I started thinking maybe I'd found someone worth." He cut himself off, shaking his head. "Forget it. Doesn't matter now." But Vanessa had heard what he almost said, and it made everything worse, because she'd been falling too, harder than she'd ever fallen for anyone, including Marcus. What she felt for Jake was different. Deeper, steadier, built on mutual respect and quiet moments rather than passionate promises that turned out to be lies. "Jake, please, let me explain everything." "I don't want to hear it." His voice had gone flat, emotionless. "I want you gone." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "What? You heard me. Pack your things. I want you off my property by tonight." Panic rose in her throat. "You can't be serious. I don't have anywhere to go." "Should have thought of that before you decided to lie to me for 3 months. Jake's expression was carved from stone. "I'll give you your final pay and a bonus for the work you've done. That should be enough to get you to wherever you're really from." "Jake, I'm 6 months pregnant with twins. Where am I supposed to go?" "Not my problem." The casual cruelty of it stole her breath. This wasn't the man who'd held her gently in the hayloft, who'd brought her extra food when he thought she wasn't eating enough, who'd reassigned her to lighter duties without her even asking. This was someone cold and distant, someone who could look at a pregnant woman and turn her out without a second thought. Fine. Pride was all she had left, and she wrapped it around herself like armor. "I'll be gone within the hour." She turned to walk away, but Jake's voice stopped her. "Vanessa." Hope fluttered in her chest as she looked back at him. "Next time you decide to use someone, maybe don't get them attached first. It's cleaner that way." The hope died as quickly as it had been born. Without another word, Vanessa walked out of the barn. Packing didn't take long. She'd never accumulated much during her time at Copper Ridge. The same duffel bag she'd arrived with held everything she owned. Jake had left an envelope with her pay on the small table in the loft, along with an extra $200 he'd called a bonus. Blood money, more like. Tommy found her as she was loading her bag into the Honda. "Vanessa, what's going on?" "Jake's." In a mood like I've never seen, she couldn't meet the young man's eyes. Tommy had been nothing but kind to her, and she was abandoning him without explanation, just like she was abandoning everything else. "I have to go." "Go where? You don't have family." Tommy stopped mid-sentence as his gaze fell to her profile. Being 6 months pregnant was harder to hide when you weren't trying anymore. "Holy shit, are you—" "Don't tell the others, please." Tommy's face cycled through the same emotions Jake's had. Surprise, understanding, then something like sympathy. "Is it Jake's?" Vanessa almost laughed at the irony. If only it were that simple. "No, it's not." "Does he know?" "He knows." She slammed the trunk of her car harder than necessary. "That's why I'm leaving." "Vanessa, wait." Tommy caught her arm gently. "Maybe if you just talk to him." "There's nothing to talk about. I lied to him. He doesn't want me here anymore." She pulled free of his grip and opened the driver's door. "Take care of yourself, Tommy." The Honda started on the third try, engine coughing like it was on its last legs. Vanessa didn't look back as she drove down the gravel road, away from Copper Ridge Ranch, away from the closest thing to home she'd found in years, away from Jake Sullivan and the life she'd briefly allowed herself to imagine. She made it 15 miles before the tears started. By the time she reached the main highway, she was sobbing so hard she could barely see the road. She pulled over at a rest stop and cried until there was nothing left, her hands pressed protectively over her belly where the twins were moving restlessly, as if they could sense her distress. 3 weeks later, living in a run-down motel room and working part-time at a diner that paid cash under the table, Vanessa's world collapsed completely. The pains started during her shift, sharp and insistent, coming too fast and too early. The other waitress, a woman named Beth, who'd taken Vanessa under her wing, took one look at her face and called 911. "It's too early," Vanessa kept saying as the paramedics loaded her into the ambulance. "It's too early. They're not supposed to come yet. But babies, as she'd learned before, don't follow schedules, especially when you're stressed, malnourished, and sleeping on a mattress that was probably older than you were." She gave birth to Jake's twins because that's how she'd started, thinking of them during those long, lonely weeks in the charity ward of St. Mary's Hospital. 2 boys, perfect and tiny and beautiful, born at 32 weeks and immediately whisked away to the NICU before she could even hold them properly. The social worker appeared the next morning with forms and gentle questions about the father, about family, about her ability to care for premature twins as a single mother with no fixed address and no steady income. "I can take care of them," Vanessa insisted, but even she could hear how hollow the words sounded. "Miss Martinez, these babies are going to need specialized care for months. Do you have health insurance, a stable living situation, support system?" Vanessa stared at the ceiling tiles and said nothing, because the answer to all those questions was no, and they both knew it. "There are families," the social worker continued gently, "good families who've been waiting years for children, families who can provide everything these boys will need. Can I think about it?" "Of course. Take all the time you need," but time was a luxury Vanessa didn't have. The boys, she'd named them Samuel and Daniel in her head, though she hadn't put it on any official paperwork, were getting stronger every day, but so were the hospital bills she couldn't pay and the questions she couldn't answer. On the 7th day, she signed the papers. 2 years passed, like a blur of regret and survival. Vanessa found work at a truck stop diner outside Billings, serving coffee and pie to travelers who never looked at her twice. She rented a studio apartment above a hardware store, furnished with cast-offs from the Salvation Army and memories she couldn't shake. Every night, she wondered about Samuel and Daniel. The adoption had been closed. No contact, no updates, just the knowledge that somewhere in Montana, two little boys who carried her DNA were learning to walk, to talk, to call someone else Mama. The social worker had assured her it was for the best, that the adoptive family was wonderful, that the boys would want for nothing. But Vanessa wanted everything. She worked double shifts to keep busy and picked up extra hours on holidays so she wouldn't have to think about the empty space in her life. Some nights she'd drive past playgrounds just to watch children play, imagining which ones might have her dark hair or the stubborn set of her chin. She never contacted Jake. What would be the point? He'd made it clear that she was nothing more than a liar who'd betrayed his trust. Besides, the twins weren't his biological children. He had no legal claim, no real connection beyond the few weeks they'd spent together before everything fell apart. At least, that's what she told herself. The truth was more complicated. Jake had been the only man who'd ever made her feel truly safe, truly valued. Even Marcus, in the beginning when things were good, had never looked at her the way Jake did, like she was someone worth protecting, worth cherishing. The memory of his hands gentle on her skin, his voice soft in the darkness of the barn loft, haunted her more than any regret about the babies. But life has a way of forcing your hand when you least expect it. It was a Tuesday in October when everything changed again. Vanessa was working the morning shift, refilling coffee for a table of construction workers, when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Excuse me, miss, could I get some coffee over here?" She turned, and her heart stopped. Tommy Richardson sat in the back booth, older now, wearing clean jeans and a button-down shirt instead of ranch clothes, but unmistakably the same young man who'd been kind to her at Copper Ridge. Their eyes met across the diner, and she watched recognition dawn on his face. Vanessa. She wanted to run, to disappear into the kitchen and out the back door, but her feet seemed rooted to the linoleum floor. Instead, she walked over with the coffee pot, her hands surprisingly steady. "Hello, Tommy." He studied her face with concern. She knew what he was seeing. The weight she'd lost, the dark circles under her eyes, the way her uniform hung loose on her frame. "Jesus, Vanessa, what are you doing here?" "Working." She poured coffee into his cup, focusing on the simple task to avoid his gaze. "Same as anyone else. But this place, you deserve better than this." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Do I? I'm not so sure about that anymore." Tommy was quiet for a moment, watching her with those earnest brown eyes that had always been too perceptive for his age. "What happened to the baby? Babies, I mean. I figured out there were two when Jake..." He stopped himself. "When Jake what?" "Nothing. Never mind." But Vanessa had heard something in his voice, something that made her pulse quicken. "Tommy, what were you going to say?" He shifted uncomfortably in the booth. "Look, it's not my place to... Please." The word came out more desperate than she'd intended. "I haven't heard anything about the ranch, about any of you in 2 years. Please." Tommy sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture that reminded her painfully of Jake. The babies. What happened to them? The old wound tore open fresh. I gave them up for adoption. They were born premature, and I didn't have anything to offer them. Christ, Vanessa. Tommy's voice was soft with sympathy. "I'm sorry. That must have been the hardest thing I've ever done." She finished the sentence before he could offer empty platitudes. But it was the right choice. They have a good family now. People who can give them everything I couldn't. Do you know where they are? No. Closed adoption. Better that way. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee absently. When he looked up at her again, there was something in his expression that made her stomach clench with anxiety. "What is it?" she asked. "What aren't you telling me?" "Jake's been looking for you." The words hit her like a physical blow. She had to grip the edge of the table to keep from swaying. "What do you mean, looking for me?" "Ever since about 6 months after you left. He hired a private investigator, had him check every diner, every motel, every place he could think of between here and Nebraska. He's been driving himself crazy trying to find you." Vanessa's mind reeled. "Why?" "He made it clear he never wanted to see me again. Because he found out the truth about Marcus Reed." The name she hadn't spoken aloud in 2 years fell between them like a stone dropped in still water. "How?" "Jake had the investigator look into your background. Found out about Marcus, about what he did to you." Tommy's jaw tightened. "Did you know the bastard's in prison now? Assault charges from his next girlfriend. Seems you weren't the first woman he knocked around." Vanessa's legs gave out. She slumped into the booth across from Tommy, the coffee pot forgotten on the table. "Jake knows. He knows Marcus was abusive. He knows you were running for your life when you came to the ranch. He knows you were trying to protect yourself and your babies." Tommy leaned forward, his voice urgent. "He also knows he screwed up royally when he threw you out." That doesn't change anything. But even as she said it, Vanessa felt something crack open in her chest, a tiny, dangerous flower of hope. "The babies still weren't his. I still lied to him. You lied because you were scared. And those babies—" Tommy stopped, seeming to wrestle with something. "Vanessa, there's something else you need to know." The hope withered as quickly as it had bloomed. "What now?" "The family that adopted your boys. Jake knows who they are." Vanessa's world tilted sideways. "That's impossible. It was a closed adoption. The records are sealed." "Money talks, especially when you're desperate enough to spend it, and Jake's been desperate for 2 years. Tommy reached across the table and took her hand. "Vanessa, your boys are living with the Hendersons on a ranch about 50 miles north of Copper Ridge. Jake's been driving by their place every few weeks just to, I don't know, to see them, I guess, to make sure they're okay. He's been stalking my children." Anger flared through her, hot and protective. "Not stalking, just watching over them. Like he feels responsible somehow." Tommy squeezed her hand. "The Hendersons are good people, Vanessa. The boys are healthy and happy. But Jake thinks you deserve to know that. He thinks you deserve to know they're close by if you ever want to... What, disrupt their lives? Confuse them? They have parents, Tommy. Real parents who've been there since they were born." "I know, and Jake knows that too. But he also thinks you deserve to have a choice, to know where they are if you ever need to know they're safe." Vanessa pulled her hand free and wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop the trembling that had started in her chest and was spreading outward. "Why are you telling me this? Why now?" Tommy looked uncomfortable again. "Because Jake doesn't know I found you. He's still looking, still hoping, and I think you both deserve a chance to figure out what comes next. There is no what comes next. He made that clear when he threw me off his ranch. From a distance." Jake's expression was carefully guarded. "I wanted to make sure they were being taken care of." "What do they look like?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, desperate and hungry. Jake was quiet for a moment, as if debating how much to tell her. "They have your eyes," he said finally, "and your stubborn chin. Samuel's bigger than Daniel, but Daniel's the one who gets into everything. They're beautiful, Vanessa. Perfect." The description was a gift and a torture all at once. Vanessa pressed a hand to her chest, trying to ease the ache there. "Thank you for watching over them." "It's not enough," Jake said roughly. "Nothing I do will ever be enough to make up for how I treated you. You don't owe me anything. I owe you everything." The words came out fierce, passionate. "Yes, I owe you an apology, an explanation, a chance to make things right. I owe you 2 years of my life that I wasted being angry instead of trying to find you." Vanessa stared at him, seeing the man she'd fallen in love with underneath the guilt and regret. Jake, I love you, he said simply. I've loved you since that first night in the barn, and I never stopped. Not when I was angry, not when I thought you'd betrayed me, not during the 2 years I spent looking for you. I love you, and I love those boys because they're part of you, and if you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you. The declaration hung in the air between them, raw and honest and terrifying in its simplicity. Vanessa felt her heart racing, felt the old fear rising up to choke her. I can't ask you to take on someone else's children. You're not asking. I'm offering. Jake's hands found hers, warm and calloused and steady. Those boys need their mother, Vanessa, and you need them. Maybe we can't undo the adoption, but we can try to find a way to be part of their lives. The Hendersons will never agree to that. Maybe not, but we'll never know unless we try. Jake squeezed her hands gently. Come back to the ranch. Stay. With me. Let's figure this out together. Vanessa looked into his eyes and saw her future there, messy and complicated and uncertain, but real. After 2 years of existing in limbo, the possibility of actually living again was almost too much to hope for. Okay, she whispered. Jake's smile was like the sunrise after the longest night. Okay? Okay. She said it stronger this time. More. Sure. I'll stay. He pulled her into his arms then, holding her tight against his chest while she breathed in the familiar scent of him, soap and leather, and something essentially Jake that she'd carried in her memory for 2 years. It felt like coming home, but as they stood there in the gathering dusk, both of them knew the hardest part was still ahead, because loving each other was only the beginning. Now they had to figure out how to build a life that included 2 little boys who belonged to someone else, and whether the love they'd found was strong enough to survive whatever came next. The approach to the Henderson ranch was a winding dirt road flanked by white wooden fences and rolling pastures dotted with horses. Vanessa's palms were slick with sweat as Jake's truck bumped along the familiar route he'd driven dozens of times over the past 2 years. This time, though, he wasn't alone, and he wasn't just driving by to catch a glimpse of 2 dark-haired boys from a distance. "You sure about this?" Jake asked for the 3rd time, glancing at Vanessa in the passenger seat. She wasn't sure about anything. 3 weeks had passed since she'd returned to Copper Ridge, 3 weeks of rebuilding their relationship and trying to figure out how to approach the Hendersons. They'd called ahead, explaining the situation as delicately as possible, asking for a meeting. To their surprise, Sarah Henderson had agreed immediately. "We always wondered if this day would come," she'd said over the phone, her voice kind but cautious. "The boys ask questions sometimes about where they came from." Now, as the main house came into view, a sprawling ranch-style home with a wraparound, porch and flower boxes under every window, Vanessa's heart hammered against her ribs. Somewhere inside that house were Samuel and Daniel, 2.5 years old now, with no memory of the woman who'd carried them for 8 months and given birth to them in a charity hospital. "They don't have to know who I am," she said suddenly. "We could just say we're friends of the family, neighbors checking in." Jake parked the truck and turned to face her fully. "Vanessa, you're their mother. You have a right to meet them properly." "Do I? I signed papers that said I gave up that right. You signed papers that gave the Hendersons legal guardianship. That doesn't erase biology, and it doesn't erase love." Jake reached over and took her hand. "Sarah and Mike are good people. They wouldn't have agreed to this meeting if they weren't open to some kind of relationship." Before Vanessa could respond, the front door of the house opened. A woman in her early 40s stepped out onto the porch, followed by a tall man with graying temples. Sarah and Mike Henderson looked exactly like the kind of people who would make excellent parents. Warm, stable, the sort of couple who sent Christmas cards and attended every school function. And then 2 small figures burst past them, racing down the porch steps with the fearless energy of toddlers. Vanessa's breath caught in her throat. Samuel and Daniel, were beautiful. Sturdy little boys with thick dark hair and bright curious eyes that were unmistakably hers. Samuel, the bigger of the two, wore a red t-shirt and had dirt smudged on his cheek. Daniel, smaller but clearly the leader, clutched a toy horse in one hand while pointing excitedly at Jake's truck with the other. "Truck! Big truck!" Daniel's voice carried across the yard, high and delighted. "That's right, buddy," Mike Henderson called after them. "But remember what we talked about. Stay on the porch until Mama and Daddy say it's okay. Mama and Daddy." The words hit Vanessa like a physical blow, but not in the way she'd expected. Instead of jealousy or resentment, she felt something closer, to relief. These children had parents who loved them, who set boundaries and used gentle correction. They were safe and cherished, exactly what she'd hoped for when she'd signed those papers. Sarah Henderson approached the truck with a nervous smile. "You must be Vanessa and Jake. I'm Sarah." Vanessa climbed out of the truck on unsteady legs. Up close, Sarah was even more intimidating. Not because she was unfriendly, but because she radiated the kind of calm competence that came from being genuinely happy in your own life. This was a woman who baked cookies from scratch and knew exactly how to get marker stains out of clothing. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us," Vanessa managed. "I know this is unusual." "Not as unusual as you might think," Sarah said gently. "We always hoped we might have a chance to thank you in person someday. Thank me for the most incredible gift imaginable." Sarah's eyes glistened with tears. "Those boys are the light of our lives. Every single day we're grateful that you were brave enough to carry them and wise enough to find them a home." The kindness in Sarah's voice almost undid Vanessa completely. She'd spent 2 years imagining this woman as a stranger who'd stolen her children. Instead, she was looking at someone who understood exactly what sacrifice looked like. "Would you like to meet them properly?" Mike asked, joining his wife. "We've told them they have a special friend visiting today, someone who knew them when they were very small." Vanessa nodded, not trusting her voice. Together, the 4 adults walked toward the porch where Samuel and Daniel waited with barely contained excitement. "Boys," Sarah said, her voice warm with affection, "this is Miss Vanessa and Mr. Jake. Can you say hello?" Samuel hung back shyly, but Daniel stepped forward with the confidence of a child who'd never known anything but love and security. "Hi," he said brightly, then held up his toy horse. "This is Thunder. He's fast." Jake crouched down to Daniel's level, and Vanessa saw something shift in his expression, wonder mixed with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "That's a beautiful horse, Daniel. What color is he?" "Brown, like real horses." Daniel looked at Vanessa with curious eyes. "Are you nice?" The innocent question broke through the last of Vanessa's composure. She knelt down beside Jake, bringing herself to eye level with the little boy she'd carried beneath her heart for 8 months. "I try to be," she said softly. "Are you nice?" Daniel giggled. "Mama says I'm nice but loud." "Loud can be good," Vanessa said, drinking in every detail of his face. "It means you have important things to say." Samuel had been watching this exchange with the serious expression of an older brother. Now he stepped closer, apparently deciding these strangers were acceptable. "I'm Samuel," he announced. "I'm bigger." "You are bigger," Jake agreed solemnly. "That means you help take care of Daniel, doesn't it?" Samuel nodded proudly. "I share my toys, sometimes." The adults laughed, and Vanessa felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders. These children were happy and secure, comfortable with strangers because they'd never been given reason to fear the world. "Would you like to see our room?" Daniel asked suddenly. "We have trucks and books and a fish named Bob." "We'd love to," Vanessa said before she could second-guess herself. The next hour passed in a blur of wonder and heartbreak. The boys' room was exactly what she would have expected. Bright and cheerful, with twin beds covered in cartoon character sheets and toys organized in bins along the walls. Samuel gravely showed her his collection of picture books, while Daniel demonstrated how fast his toy trucks could go across the hardwood floor. They were perfect, healthy and intelligent, and loved beyond measure. Watching them interact with Sarah and Mike, Vanessa could see the deep bonds that had formed over 2.5 years of daily care, bedtime stories, and scraped knees kissed better. "They're incredible," she whispered to Sarah as they watched Jake help the boys build an elaborate tower with wooden blocks. "They are," Sarah agreed, "and they have your eyes. Mike and I always wondered." She trailed off, seeming to debate whether to continue. "Wondered what?" "If you ever regretted your choice, if you ever wanted to know how they were doing." Vanessa watched Daniel carefully place another block on the tower, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration. "Every day. But seeing them, now seeing how loved they are, I know I made the right choice." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Vanessa, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "What would you like from this? From us, I mean." "We're open to the boys knowing you're their birth mother someday, when they're old enough to understand. But for now, I just want to know they're okay," Vanessa said honestly. "I want to know they're happy and safe and loved." "Which they clearly are." "They are," Sarah confirmed. "But Mike and I have been talking, and we think, if you're interested, maybe we could arrange regular visits. Nothing that would confuse them, just occasional play dates. You could be part of their lives without disrupting the stability they need." The offer was more than Vanessa had dared to hope for. "You would do that? Those boys are lucky to have you as their birth mother," Sarah said firmly. "And we're lucky to have you trust us with them. We believe children benefit from having more adults who love them, not fewer." Across the room, the block tower toppled with a spectacular crash, sending both boys into fits of giggles. Jake looked over at Vanessa, his face alight with joy and something that looked like hope. "What do you think?" Sarah asked gently. "Would you like to be part of their lives?" Vanessa looked at Samuel and Daniel, at Jake, at this woman who'd opened her home and heart to children who weren't biologically hers. 2 years ago, she'd thought her story was over, that she'd lost everything that mattered. Now she was being offered something she'd never imagined possible. A chance to know her boys, to watch them grow, to be part of their extended family in whatever way worked for everyone. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and sure. "I would like that very much." As if sensing the importance of the moment, Daniel looked up from where he was gathering scattered blocks. "Miss Vanessa, will you come play with us again? If your mama and daddy say it's okay, then yes, I'd love to come play with you again." Daniel beamed and went back to his blocks, already moving on to whatever new adventure his 2-year-old mind had conceived. Samuel continued stacking blocks with careful precision, occasionally glancing over to make sure the adults were still watching. Later, as they drove back to Copper Ridge Ranch, Vanessa stared out the window at the Montana landscape. Rolling by, the future she was building with Jake wasn't the traditional family she'd once dreamed of, but it was something uniquely theirs, complicated and unconventional, and more beautiful than anything she could have planned. "No regrets?" Jake asked, reaching over to take her hand. "None," she said, and meant it. For the first time in 2 years, she was exactly where she belonged. 1 year later, Vanessa stood in the kitchen of the main house at Copper Ridge Ranch, flour dusting her apron as she rolled out pie crust for Thanksgiving dinner. Through the window, she could see Jake teaching Samuel and Daniel how to properly hold a rope, their small hands wrapped around the thick cord as they practiced the basic knots every ranch kid needed to know. The boys visited every other weekend, now a schedule that had evolved naturally over the months. What had started as cautious afternoon visits had grown into overnight stays, complete with sleeping bags on the living room floor and pancake breakfasts that left syrup sticky on everything, within a 3-foot radius. "Higher, Mr. Jake," Daniel called out. jumping up and down as Jake demonstrated a lasso technique. At 3.5, Daniel had inherited none of his birth mother's caution. He approached the world with the fearless enthusiasm of a child who'd never doubted his place in it. Samuel, more thoughtful by nature, studied Jake's movements with serious concentration. "Like this?" he asked, making a careful loop with his smaller rope. "Perfect, buddy. You're a natural." Vanessa smiled as she watched them together. Jake had taken to fatherhood, or whatever his role in the boys' lives could be called, with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else. He never overstepped the boundaries they'd all agreed upon, never tried to replace Mike Henderson in the boys' affections. Instead, he'd become something unique, part mentor, part friend, part protector. The sound of approaching vehicles made her look up from her pie crust. Sarah and Mike Henderson's SUV pulled into the driveway, followed by a second car she didn't recognize. The boys immediately abandoned their rope practice and raced toward their adoptive parents, chattering excitedly about everything they'd learned during their weekend stay. "Mama, Daddy, I can make a real knot," Samuel announced proudly, holding up his practice rope. "And I helped feed the horses," Daniel added, bouncing on his toes. "Thunder remembered me," Sarah laughed, gathering both boys into a hug. "Sounds like you had quite an adventure. Did you remember to thank Miss Vanessa and Mr. Jake?" The boys dutifully ran back to deliver enthusiastic thank you hugs before returning to their parents. Vanessa wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside, curious about the unfamiliar car. A woman in her 60s emerged from the passenger seat, followed by a man of similar age. There was something familiar about the woman's posture, the way she held her head, that made Vanessa's breath catch. "Vanessa," Sarah called out, her voice carrying a note of nervous excitement. "There's someone we'd like you to meet. This is Mike's mother, Patricia Henderson, and his father, Robert. They've been asking to meet you for months." Patricia Henderson stepped forward with a warm smile. "My dear, I hope you don't mind us showing up unannounced. I couldn't wait another day to thank you properly." Before Vanessa could respond, the older woman had enveloped her in a surprisingly strong hug. "Thank you," Patricia whispered in her ear. "Thank you for giving us our grandsons." The simple words, spoken with such genuine emotion, brought tears to Vanessa's eyes. She'd been so focused on the boys' relationship with Sarah and Mike that she'd never considered the extended family. Grandparents, aunts and uncles, cousins who might want to know her too. "They're incredible boys," Vanessa managed. "You're all lucky to have each other." "We know we are," Robert Henderson said, his voice gruff with emotion. "And we want you to know you'll always be welcome in our family, all of our family." The afternoon that followed was unlike anything Vanessa had experienced. Patricia immediately commandeered the kitchen, insisting on helping with Thanksgiving preparations, while sharing stories about Mike's childhood and asking gentle questions about Vanessa's own background. Robert settled into conversation with Jake about ranch management, the two men finding common ground in their love of the land. Meanwhile, Samuel and Daniel flitted between the adults, secure in their place as the center of everyone's attention. They called their biological grandparents Grandma Pat and Grandpa Bob, titles that had apparently been established from their very first meeting. "They accepted us immediately," Patricia explained to Vanessa as they worked side by side, preparing, stuffing. "Children are so much better at complex family situations than adults are. They just understand that more people loving them is always better. Sometimes I feel guilty about disrupting their lives," Vanessa admitted. "They were perfectly happy before I came back into the picture." "Were they?" Patricia paused in her chopping to look at Vanessa directly. "Or were they missing a piece they didn't even know existed? Because I can tell you that since these visits started, those boys have been more settled, more complete somehow. Like they finally had answers to questions they didn't know how to ask." The observation surprised Vanessa. She'd been so worried about confusing the boys that she'd never considered they might actually benefit from knowing their birth mother. Besides, Patricia continued with a sly smile. Sarah tells me there might be another reason for these visits soon enough. Vanessa felt heat rise in her cheeks. 3 months ago, Jake had proposed, not with grand gestures or elaborate speeches, but with the same quiet certainty he brought to everything important. They'd been sitting on the porch after the boys had gone to sleep, watching the stars emerge. In the vast Montana sky. "Marry me," he'd said simply, reaching for her hand. "Are you asking or telling me?" she'd replied, but her heart was already racing. "Both. I love you, Vanessa Martinez. I love the woman you are now, the mother you were brave enough to be, the partner you've become. I want to build a life with you, whatever that looks like." The wedding was planned for next spring, a small ceremony here at the ranch with all their chosen family in attendance. Sarah and Mike had already offered to coordinate the boys' schedules so they could participate. Samuel as ring bearer, Daniel as flower boy, though they'd probably need backup rings given Daniel's tendency to lose. Important objects. "The boys are excited about the wedding," Patricia said now, as if reading her thoughts. Daniel told his preschool teacher that his other mama was marrying his ranch daddy, and he was going to throw flowers everywhere. The casual way Patricia referred to her as the boys' other mama sent a warm glow through Vanessa's chest. For so long, she'd felt like she existed in the margins of their lives, never quite belonging anywhere. But this family had made space for her in the most natural way possible. As the afternoon wore on, more people arrived for their informal Thanksgiving gathering. Tommy Richardson appeared with his new girlfriend, a veterinarian named Lisa, who immediately charmed everyone by treating the boys' stuffed animals for various imaginary ailments. Carlos brought his wife and teenage daughters, who delighted in having small children to spoil. Even old Pete made an appearance, grumbling about too much fuss, while sneaking extra rolls to Samuel and Daniel. Watching the chaos of conversation and laughter filling her home, Vanessa marveled at how much her life had changed. 2 years ago, she'd been alone and desperate, eating Thanksgiving dinner from a vending machine in a hospital cafeteria. Now she was surrounded by people who loved her, not in spite of her complicated past, but because of the journey that had brought her. "Here," Jake appeared at her elbow, slipping an arm around her waist. "Penny, for your thoughts? Just thinking about how different things are from last year? Better?" She leaned into his solid warmth, watching Samuel carefully explain the proper way to fold napkins to Grandpa Bob, while Daniel attempted to steal stuffing directly from the serving bowl. "So much better I can barely believe it's real sometimes." "It's real," Jake said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Complicated and messy and absolutely perfect." As if summoned by their quiet conversation, both boys appeared at their sides simultaneously. "Miss Vanessa," Samuel said with the formality he always used when making important announcements, "Mama Sarah says, after you marry Mr. Jake, we can call you Aunt Vanessa if we want to." "Only if you want to," Vanessa said carefully. "You don't have to call me anything special, but I want to," Daniel chimed in, grabbing her hand with sticky fingers. "Aunt Vanessa sounds pretty." The title settled over her like a blessing. Not Mama. That belonged to Sarah, who'd earned it through midnight fevers and scraped knees and countless bedtime stories. But Aunt, a person who loved you unconditionally, but from a slightly different angle. Someone who was there for the big moments and the small ones, who remembered your birthday and slipped you extra cookies when your parents weren't looking. "I would be honored to be your Aunt Vanessa," she said solemnly. Both boys beamed and raced off to share this momentous news with anyone who would listen, leaving Jake and Vanessa alone for a moment in the controlled chaos of their extended family. "No regrets?" Jake asked the same question he'd posed that day she'd returned to the ranch. Vanessa looked around at the life they'd built. Unconventional, complicated, absolutely perfect in its imperfection. 2 boys who would grow up knowing exactly where they came from, and how much they were loved by everyone in their orbit. A man who'd waited for her to find her way back to herself before offering his heart. A family that defied traditional definitions, but worked because it was built on honesty and love, and the radical idea that there was always room for one more person at the table. None, she said, and meant it completely. Not a single one. Outside, the Montana sky was painted in shades of gold and orange, promising a cold night and a bright tomorrow. Inside, the people she loved most in the world were gathered around a table laden with food and gratitude, and the kind of joy that only comes from finding your way home against all odds. It wasn't the ending she'd planned when she'd first driven. Down that dusty road to Copper Ridge Ranch, it was better, it was real, and it was theirs. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.